This is first lecture for Friday, April 17th. Today, we're going to talk about the flow of nutrients through ecosystems. We've spent this time looking at energy, seeing how energy comes from the sun. Almost all of the energy that's channeled through living things on Earth comes from the sun. With nutrients, it's going to be a different situation where these nutrients come from different sources. They're channeled through different organisms. There's a living part and there's a non-living part where these nutrients are stored in different parts of the ecosystem where they exist in addition to living things. So first of all, before we get to the specific nutrients or materials like water, carbon, nitrogen, some of the other ones, we're going to talk about the cycling of nutrients. First, to identify the difference between nutrient cycling and energy flow through ecosystems. There's no energy cycling, it's just energy flow. You could talk about nutrient flow, but it's really nutrient cycling. There's very different situations that exist in terms of how nutrients are cycled through ecosystems on land and in the water. So we're going to look at those, and then we're going to fall back to this idea of disturbance and how disturbance is a natural part of a lot of different communities, different ecosystems, and this pattern of disturbance we saw with succession. Succession is not just the organisms that are found there, the different types of communities that progress from early successional stages to a climax community. There's also big changes that take place in terms of nutrients that are available in ecosystems as a result of disturbance. Then we'll look at individual materials, starting with water. Look at the water cycle. So in terms of nutrient cycling, now we're talking about energy to begin with, that we looked at earlier in the week, is constrained by the laws of thermodynamics that apply to heat and energy. Heat is a form of energy. But this energy comes from the sun, as I said, flows through organisms, and then it's lost. It's lost to the universe, primarily as heat. Nutrients, on the other hand, it's not a one-way flow through ecosystems. In fact, they're cycled. And some of these, there's a big component of these in non-living parts of the world, of the earth. For instance, water. There's water in the air, there's water in the clouds, there's water in rain, there's water in streams, there's water in the ocean. There's also water in living things. There's carbon in living things. There's carbon in sediments. There's carbon in rocks. Same thing with phosphate and some of these other elements that we're going to look at, sulfur. So rather than just being a cycle through living things, it's actually a cycle. These nutrients are cycled between part non-living and part living things. And so a more proper way to refer to these cycles is as biogeochemical cycles, which implies that some of it is biological when these nutrients are in living things, geological when some of these nutrients are in sediment or rocks, and chemical where some of these materials are in different chemical forms, not necessarily in living things, not necessarily in rocks. They might be in the air, they might be in the water. And so this idea of biogeochemical cycles really describes what's happening with nutrients like carbon or some of the other really important nutrients, nitrogen, phosphate, those kind of things, as they're flowing through ecosystems and they're being cycled within ecosystems. And all of this, there's different forces that drive these cycles, primarily energy from the sun, which is maybe transferred to energy that organisms use for work, ATP, producing work, energy that's used for work for them to do different things, and then gravity, erosion, those type of things as well. So there's a connection in terms of nutrients in the cycling of these nutrients, unlike what we see in energy. So at different points during the semester, I've pointed out why some of these different elements, for instance, are important. If you talk about water, water is obviously important for living things. Most living things can only live a couple of days without water. Water is obviously very important, but carbon makes up proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Those four main type of macromolecules, they're all based on the structure of carbon. We're carbon-based life forms. Carbon is really important. Things that contain carbon, these organic substances, are what we can break down in our cells for fuel. Organic substances, not inorganic substances. Very few living things that can use inorganic substances to make ATP. Nitrogen, found in every protein, every amino acid, every ATP, every DNA, every RNA contains nitrogen. Phosphate is in every ATP, every DNA, every RNA. So those are some examples of nutrients that are really, really important for living things, for energy, for growth, for all these different processes that are important for living things to be able to survive. So these nutrients, as they're flowing through, cycling within ecosystems, they occur very differently in terrestrial settings than aquatic settings. So let's first look at terrestrial settings, where we'll see that most of the metabolic reactions that take place there involve oxygen. They're mostly aerobic, and there's a regeneration of nutrients that happens fairly quickly. It depends on the ecosystem that you're talking about. But these nutrients, they're readily available for terrestrial organisms because they're in the soil. In aquatic systems, it's very different. Most of the metabolism that takes place in aquatic systems is aerobic, so it involves the use of oxygen. But in some aquatic ecosystems, there's a fair amount of anaerobic metabolism that's taking place. Bacteria. What that means is they're not using oxygen to make ATP like everything else. It's involved in aerobic respiration. And the source of these nutrients and the way that these nutrients are cycled, there's no soil in the ocean or in a lake. There are sediments on the bottom. So in some ways, if it's a shallow situation, then it's similar. It can be similar to soil on land, but in a lot of parts of the ocean, the major parts of the ocean, these sediments are hundreds, if not thousands of meters away from the photosynthetic organisms that need those nutrients that are up at the surface. They die, they sink down to the bottom. And as a result, they're hundreds or, as I said, thousands of meters away from the organisms that need them. Very different situation than on land, where the soil is right there at your feet, where your roots are. So let's look at this first in terms of terrestrial settings, and we'll see the relative contribution of nutrients from weathering, like rocks being eroded. Those rocks contain different elements that are important, different nutrients that are important for living things. But it's only a minor contribution. Most of the nutrients that living things obtain on land, terrestrial situations, comes from detritus, dead, decaying organic matter, dead leaves, dead penguins, dead animals. That's where these terrestrial organisms obtain most of their nutrients. So let's look at those two sources. First of all, looking at weathering, and then we'll look at detritus. This is, like I said, there's a rock. This rock contains sulfur, it contains phosphate, it contains some nitrogen maybe, it contains silica, contains calcium, contains carbon, magnesium, potassium, all these different elements that are important nutrients for living things. Living things use nitrogen, those examples that I gave before, phosphate, those examples that I gave before, but the silica and the shells and the cell walls of different living things. There's sulfur that makes up certain components within living things. There's iron that's important, for instance, in our hemoglobin. Sodium and potassium, very important nutrients for transport of substances across the cell membrane and for cells to depolarize. So the point is, one source of these nutrients are basically rocks. And so there's a certain amount of this. These rocks are broken down by erosion. It rains, the water leaches these nutrients out of the rocks. The rocks become smaller and smaller and smaller. Parts of the rocks and the nutrients that are leached from these rocks are what is mixed in with organic matter to form soil. But that's a small contribution. If you look at the amount of nitrogen and calcium, magnesium and potassium, all these different nutrients, it's a relatively minor contribution from weathering, about 10%, but it's still a certain contribution. And these are rocks that are being weathered. Now that's not a living thing. That's not an organic form of those nutrients. It's an inorganic geological formation that is contributing some of these nutrients. It may be a minor contribution, but it's a very different type of contribution. Now let's look at detritus. On land, detritus is really, really important. There's some marine ecosystems where detritus is very important as well. But you've got a plant. Its leaves fall off in the winter. You know, a lot of you have to go rake the leaves from your yard as your job. But these leaves, if you don't rake them, they'll break down, they're decomposed, and they start to form soil. It takes different amounts of time. We looked at soil formation months ago, earlier in this class. And then you have a deer that's out there, it dies, and it's incorporated into the soil. You have a bear that's going to the bathroom, that nitrogenous waste, the excrement, enters into the soil. So you've got these different sources of organic matter from living things, whether it's leaves or branches or a dead squirrel. That's their end result, is that they're incorporated into the soil and they become part of this detritus. Now there's some things that feed on detritus. They specialize feeding on detritus. There's other things that eat plants, herbivores. There's other things that eat other animals, carnivores. But there's a number of different organisms that are specialists in feeding on detritus. There's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of nutrients in this detritus. So bacteria are important for getting detritus back into a deer or a bear or an elephant or whatever. And they're involved in this cycling. But if you look in a forest, for example, here's our example, because they're forests, they have trees, they have leaves. These leaves fall down to the ground and they eventually become incorporated into the detritus, and they eventually make their way back into other organisms. That's nutrient cycling that involves detritus. So in contrary to what we saw with the weathering and rocks contributing nutrients, this is a very large supply of the nutrients that you find within an ecosystem. This is how nutrients are cycled in an ecosystem, not so much from inorganic things, but from organic sources. And you see there's a very large percentage of the plant biomass that enters into the detritus pool, and that's eventually recycled into the ecosystem. It makes its way into other plants. That nitrogen makes its way into a bear eventually, those kind of things. So let's look at the formation of this detritus. As I said, it's There's a lot of leaves, there's grass, there's the different primary producers that die, fall to the ground. There's animals that die as well, but as we saw, looking at the trophic levels and the trophic pyramids, there's a much greater biomass of producers like plants than there are of consumers. So this leaf litter, when plants lose their leaves, trees lose their leaves, they fall to the ground. This is an important component of detritus, and it's this process of forming detritus occurs different ways. There's different contributions to this detritus, getting nutrients out of leaf litter, leaves that are laying on the ground, and into the soil. Part of it, it's wet, it rains, and the water percolates through these leaves and dissolves some of those nutrients. So there's a small contribution of nutrients from water that's just percolating through the leaves, through this leaf litter. It's a small contribution, but there's some nutrients that are water soluble that make their way from these leaves, and then the water enters into the soil, and those nutrients are delivered that way. There's a lot of energy, a lot of nutrients that are ingested or consumed by detritivores. So these things feed on organic matter, basically. They eat soil, things like worms. They eat soil, they extract the organic matter out of it, get nutrients and get energy. The rest of it is lost in their feces. They excrete this, and that contains a lot of nutrients. However, they're processing this detritus. They're breaking it down. Their enzymes are acting upon it. They're making it a lot more available to other things, especially bacteria. So these large detritivores are really important decomposers for the most part. Another contribution is wood. There's not very many things that can digest wood, but fungi can break down wood. Bacteria that has a cellulase enzyme can digest wood, the cellulose in wood. So that's another contribution of especially carbon, but other nitrogen and phosphate as well. And then bacteria, as I mentioned, have a big role in this nutrient cycling. Big role in terms of you've got this nitrogen that's in a leaf, a dead leaf that's laying on the ground. This leaf nitrogen comes out of the leaf into the soil. It's still not part of any living thing. It's just nitrogen that's sitting there. Well, bacteria can incorporate that nitrogen into their cells. These bacteria are fed on by some little organism, and that little organism is fed on by an insect. That insect is fed on by a bird. The bird is fed on by a fox. And that fox is fed on by an eagle. Now you've got nitrogen in an eagle. That nitrogen is a long ways from the soil that it was in when it's in that eagle. And that eagle is a long ways from eating nitrogen in the soil. But that's an example of how you can get nitrogen cycled involving bacteria. Another important component of detritus cycling, breaking down organic matter into detritus and getting it into available forms, is getting it out of the soil and into plants. And a lot of this involves these fungi called mycorrhizae. So different types of soil that have different types of plants growing them have different types of detritus. There's different quality detritus. You know, there's different amounts of nitrogen and phosphate that's in the soil, that's incorporated into the soil from the detritus. And it depends on the plants that you're talking about being broken down. It depends on how resistant their leaves are to being broken down and incorporated into the detritus. They're eventually broken down and they make their way into the detritus, but it takes different amounts of time depending on how easily their leaves are broken down. So here's an example with if you look at the leaf litter from beech trees versus mulberry trees, and how much nutrient deposition there's been from these leaves into the soil after 1 year. And you see there's a big difference between beech and mulberry depending on how easily their leaves are broken down, how easily these nutrients make their way from the leaves into the detritus and into the soil. And if you're talking about fir trees or pine trees, those decompose much more slowly than these deciduous trees. It depends on how much lignin there is, this protein that's part of the leaves. It depends on the cellulose. It depends on the amount of nitrogen. It depends on the amount of phosphate or phosphorus. And it depends on how resistant their leaves are to being decomposed in the first place. So let's look at two other components of this formation of detritus, and then we'll be done with this lecture for today. One is this mycorrhizae, and then the second is the influence of climate. So first of all, if you look at the roots of plants, if you were out and you pulled up some plant and you looked at its roots and you looked closely, or if you just dug down in the ground and came across some plant root, and you looked at those roots closely, you'd see that a huge number of plants have this fungi associated with their roots. So it doesn't say that in this slide, I don't think. But this is a symbiotic relationship between the plants and the fungi. And the fungi have these sheaths that they produce. That's how they grow around the root. That's what you'd see if you pulled up the roots of some plant. So what the plants get out of this is a big surface area and another helper, basically, that's extracting nutrients out of the soil, in addition to what the roots of the plants are doing. So it's a much more extensive network of getting nutrients out of the soil. And first it's going into these fungi, but eventually it goes into the plants through the roots. The fungi get nutrients from the plant roots as well, plus they have a place to live. They have a home. And so it's a symbiotic relationship in that extent. And the mycorrhizae are very good at extracting nutrients from the soil. There's a much bigger surface area for them to extract nutrients. And the way that fungi work, which is different than plants and animals, is that they secrete enzymes outside of their cells and they digest things. So they're digesting this organic matter, breaking the nutrients down, and then incorporating it into their cells, whether it's carbon or nitrogen or phosphate. And then it's transferred, some of it is transferred into the cells of plants through their roots. And one other thing to mention is the influence of climate on the formation of detritus. There's a big difference in the rate of detritus formation depending on where you are. It depends on the type of plants that are there. It depends on the erosion. It depends on the amount of rainfall. It depends on temperature. So if you're some obvious comparisons that you can make. Two different ecosystems, two different climates. Is a temperate climate where it's kind of cold. It might rain a decent amount, but it doesn't rain that much. You've got some deciduous plants. Sometimes you've got some conifers like pine trees or fir trees versus a tropical soil. Tropics. In the tropics, it's very warm. It rains a lot. And so you have different scenarios for soil formation, or we're not just talking about soil, but detritus as well. So in temperate soils, you've got this gradual breakdown. It's a constant supply of organic matter that's being broken down. There's a lot of seasonality to this when leaves fall off the trees in the fall, and they're broken down all winter and spring and even into the next summer, forming soil. In the tropics, it rains a lot. It's very warm. The soil is different with not so much clay. It's not a very good soil for retaining nutrients. So there's this rapid turnover of nutrients from the detritus into the plants, and then back the plants die, their leaves fall off, and then the cycle is pretty quickly. So you can have some really thick, deep soils in the tropics that are tens or even hundreds of meters deep. And so the plants don't have as much of an opportunity to extract those nutrients because it's a shorter turnaround time. But this symbiotic relationship between plants and mycorrhizae is very good at getting those nutrients out of the soil and into the plants. Okay, well, that's a short summary of nutrient cycling in terrestrial situations. For the second lecture, we'll look at nutrient cycling in aquatic systems and see it's very, very different situation.